Osio, Sidunela, hello family. Dagote, um, Losichin, Kibiawu. God bless you. Yaki, greeting. Okay, tonight we'll get into Black indigenous genealogy of Oklahoma and where to start looking. This is part two of a genealogy search. All right, let's jump right into the material. All right, the Civil War started in Oklahoma, right? Most of the native nations sided with the Confederate States, the Confederate States of America, known as CSA. Now, there were a few Cherokees who fought on both sides, and a few Seminoles and a few Creeks that fought on the Union side. Union side. In fact, they were known as the loyal. I didn't get my foot. Sorry about that, y'all. I had a brief um, issue going on. All right. So the Loyal Creeks, basically, the leader of the Loyal Creeks was known as Othi Tahola, and he took his group of Black Creeks and other Red Creeks across from the Indian Territory, and they settled in Kansas, basically. And they had to fight their way into Kansas, basically. And during that time, it was cold, it was raining. They didn't have anything to eat. Some of them were naked. Some of them had to leave horses. Other horses, when they got to the fort in Kansas, basically, there was nothing hardly there except for the fort, no food, no shelter. Basically, they had to get it out the mud. Well, at first, though, let me back up a little. At the start of the Civil War, Othiohola decided to remain neutral. He didn't want to, but then he finally decided to send a letter to Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln said they will be provided shelter. So that's why they were able to leave Oklahoma Indian Territory and go to Kansas so they could get away from the Confederates. Now let's explain why the Native nations decided to join the Confederacy. The same Native nations that left Mississippi were the same first two nations that joined the Confederacy, the Choctaw or Chickasha or Chickasaw. Both were the first to make an agreement with them. You might ask, why would they side with the same people that kicked them out of the old indigenous territory and got them moved out? Well, number one was there would be peace and friendship. They promised they would be protected against the United States by the Confederates. Their boundaries would be defined. They even promised them the states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. They would have that. They would have a House and representative, one person in the House of Representatives in the Confederate States of America will represent their nation. And even to this day, it's only one person from the Cherokee Nation that fulfills this role. So I understand why they chose this, because they were promised a lot of things that they were not eventually given. And we'll get into that later, how it backfired by joining the Confederates. But let's go back to the genealogy. Let's move back. So when the Blacks got to Kansas, the Blacks Creeks, they started to join the Union, and they formed the first and the second Indian Home Guard. And there was actually, this is where you guys got to pay attention. The first rolls that were made for the military rolls, they were called the muster rolls. They were made up of African, both free and enslaved. You could find them enlisted. And other enslaved blacks from Missouri and Northwest Arkansas, as well as Indian Territory, would come to Arkansas, and they would form the first and second colored infantry. And the same group of Creeks and Cherokees that left, the ones that I mentioned earlier, that left and fought on the Union side, they would form the Kansas Colored Infantry, and it was redesigned as the United States Colored Troops, forming the 78th and the 83rd Infantry of the United States Colored Troops. So when you guys are looking for your ancestors, you might want to start looking at old Civil War enlistments, muster rolls, Indian Home Guard, Kansas Colored Infantry. And on this battlefield, one of the first battles that they fought was the Battle of Honey Creek. Yes, that's right, the Battle of Honey Creek. They would fight against the Confederates, both white and other indigenous slave owners, and the South suffered heavily during this battle. You might also look under the pensions of the soldiers from the Home Guard, the United States Colored Troop, and the Colored and Kansas Colored. It has a lot of critical family data. You can't look over that from blacks from Indian Territory. One thing significant about this also, it would describe their indigenous name. It would describe their features. And it also would have their creek names. Although the muster roll is for military purposes, it also is just there for historical purposes, basically. Also, another thing that you might, when you're looking for your Cherokee ancestors, you might want to look at what's called the first mounted rifles. Oh, let me go back. The first Cherokee mounted rifles, that's one group you want to look for. You want to look for the Chickasaw Infantry, the first Choctaw and Chickasaw mounted rifles, the first Creek mounted volunteers, and the second Cherokee mounted volunteers, and the second Creek mounted volunteers. There were smaller divisions and units that complete a listing that can be obtained as the microfilm guide when you look in the National Archives. The National Archives is basically where you want to look up these items at, basically. Basically, when they aligned themselves with the Confederates, they started to lose their treaties with the United States. And all of their territory was given to Plains Indians and also tribes like the Lenape, Delaware, or the Swanoo, the Shawnee, that served counterproductive. As the war ended in 1865, a lot of the black indigenous slaves remained into 1866 at Fort Smith when the final emancipation treaties were signed. So that's a whole nother year that black indigenous people would remain in captivity to the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokees. And I know that they had to grant all of them the same opportunity as their own citizens, meaning they had a right to education, they had a right to vote on the council, they had rights to housing, they had rights to medical care. Whatever a citizen got, they would get it too in order to fully incorporate them. The same as if a free black from the South would get. But some, but a lot of land was lost. But some natives were able to obtain about 60%. Remember, I talked about Chief Otho Hoya, his group, 60% of their property that was lost during the war was given to him. That was about 300 persons who had African and Creek ancestry. And about 300 of the 300, approximately 60 from the Indian Home Guard were identified. I'm going to give you a name: Sugar George, Henry Island, and Monday Durant, all prominent Indian histories, were among black soldiers listed. These men, leaders in the Creek Nation to the turn of the century. So maybe if you have some of these last names and you can link them, maybe this could be one of your ancestors, maybe. So like I said, you need to really look down on these go to Oklahoma, maybe if you're people from Oklahoma, or just searching these to start with these military Civil War documents. I mean, another thing that you guys want to remember is that when they freed their slaves, they had to abide by the United States government's rules of fair treatment. And one of the most important things was schools were already established in the native nations. So the Choctaws and the Chickasaws opened these schools up, but it was harder in the Chickasaw Nation because once before they didn't per se accept all of their freemen. You know what I'm saying? Well, the Creeks were the first to establish schools for the freemen. And then within a short period time, the Choctaws, they opened up a school called Tuscaloosa, a Choctaw word meaning black warrior, was among neighboring schools for the Choctaw freemen, basically. By the turn of the century, Tallahassee Freeman School would become a gem in the Creek Nation, and it would be complemented by the beautiful grounds of Oak Hill Academy in Southeast Chickasaw Nation. Um, as time pushed forward, you know what I'm saying? Eventually, even in the Chickasaw Nation, they received land and schools. Um, but there were fewer opportunities given for almost 4 decades. So as they started to break up a lot of native territory after they opened it up to all people, basically, there was approximately 400 blacks that were enumerated in Indian territory in various nations. Within the Seminole Nation, one could even locate and but famed Negro Abraham. So like a lot of the Abraham's family were there. Among them, there was John, Caesar, Abraham, and the ones that you could find in Georgia and Florida as a homeland, basically. Also, there was a push for the Cherokees, Choctaw, and Chickasaw and Creeks would eventually sue, but it took at least 4 decades of legal challenges to win land, education, and citizenship for the former slaves of these nations. Note that in 1840, a small group of several hundred Seminoles moved to Texas and Mexico. So there were a lot of people that left Indian territory during that were Seminole, went to Texas and Mexico, and they became known as Muskogos, basically. And they still live on this territory to this day. Okay, they said that the freemen and the Indians rarely mingled. In the Choctaw Nation, the schools were separate. However, there were informal mingling within them with restriction. Man, so they yes, they kept separate on purpose. You know what I'm saying? I know from personal experience that there's a lot of different things that they feel about blacks and stuff like that in Oklahoma. But I'm thinking it's changing now somewhat. You're gonna have to just give and take. These are people who are former Confederates, the former Southern people. So that idea of I'm better than you has to die out, right? You have to let all of that mentality die, basically, in order for you to move forward. By by the midst of 1880, life was changing. Dozens of schools were dotted in the towns and settlements throughout the nation. The Choctaws, once reluctant to change, had made appropriation for their color school by 1890s. 34 colored neighboring schools have been established. In the Chickasaw Nation, they had 21 schools, and they continued their tribal systems to debate and argue about the status of freemen, basically. So basically, a lot of them argued like, did the freemen have the right to remain in the nation among the Chickasaw and Choctaw, even though they knew that they were sleeping with their slaves during that time, even though they knew their women were intermarrying with the African men or black men or Negro men, because there's these various status that when I read the treaties, I see sometimes they say Negro, sometimes they say African. So that's the language that they use. So you have to think they were still having African slaves that they were purchasing at a certain period of time. The intermixing in Negroes, the mixing between African and Native put together. We have to keep that real, even though I see a lot on these channels that they don't, but because they trying to be something they're not, right? Moving forward, because of the steady flow of blacks and whites in the Indian Territory after the war, the nations also now struggle to control immigration into their land. Ironically, the statement of loyalty to the Chickasaw Nation, the Chickasaw Freemen were never adopted by the Chickasaw Nation. And that's one of the things now that they have to face, that I don't understand how they got away with signing the 1866 treaty. That's all of them said that they would take their former slaves and make them citizens. For they got away with it. The Cherokee Nation honored it finally in 2017, 100%. The Seminole Nation immediately took them. And even now, the Creek Nation has to honor people who can prove their lineage in the Freeman that could prove that in the Muskogee Creek Nation. So I know the Choctaws were talking about having, in Chickasaw too, of having a discussion with their tribe. So it's going to be a long fight. I think it took 100 years for the Cherokees. It's probably going to take a long fight for the Creeks and the Choctaws. But I can see the Choctaws, Choctaw taking them back quicker than it would be for the Chickasaws. They'll try to probably fight tooth and nail. And then what happened in 1889, the land rush was organized. 100,000 men, women, and children entered the territory. It was estimated about 10,000 immigrants were black from the deep south. So there were more black folks pouring into Oklahoma at that time period. And by 1890, there were 27 all black towns that would eventually become Oklahoma. These towns would consist of both Indian freemen and former United States slaves. So there's a mixture right there. I didn't notice that Edward McCambie, a black Kansas state auditor, launched plans to establish Oklahoma as a black state. However, both Indian and white populations fought vigorously against this plan. I can understand why, if this was the indigenous place, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, blacks put the land in. They would have to really talk about that. I understand that, but yeah, you can't just come in and make, another group of people that has, yeah, they put the work in. Don't get me wrong. They should be compensated, everything, but just to name that, I don't know. It seems like that's what a lot of people are doing now. They're trying to claim all these things, these tribes. Not to say they may have some blood in it, but they don't know the language on the culture. But moving forward, when you're looking back, you might want to start in Oklahoma. But if your family is from a different spot, you might want to move to a southern state, basically. Now, I'm going to have somebody come on here and talk to you more about this, basically. I'm going to, go ahead and give this information. Within the Indian nation, statehood was becoming inevitable. Final settlements were made for all citizens of each nation. The Black Indians sought to be entered on one tribal roll and to obtain the benefits of payment and land allotments given to the other Indian citizens. When it was time to apply for enrollment, the freemen had distinguished themselves from other blacks that poured into the Indian territory after emancipation during the land rush. The commission established to make political division to land allotments to citizens of the nation and eventually will bring the disillusionment of sovereignty of nations in famous the Das Commission. So basically, the Das Commission came about to break up tribal land and to allot it to individuals. Instead of saying the Cherokee Nation owns it, we could say Man Killer owns it. We could say the Ross owns it. We could say the Bergens, the Smith, the Johns, the Walkers own that area basically. So now we know that everybody should know about the Das Commission is where you get the Das rolls, basically. And that's where my friend will start to come in and talk. He's a very special guest. I will have him on this week. That's why I wanted to start making this post for you guys to know. I'm going to read this also to you guys. Hundreds of thousands of documents emerged from the works of the commission. The Freeman records numbers also in the thousands would be discussed in full detail. The DOS records provide much substance, the research of Indian Territory Freeman. However, there was not exclusive sets of records upon a researcher should rely on. So you can't just rely on one. The census records, the DOS records were also a political purpose, and there were other bodies of records that will provide more clarity for researchers you cannot overlook. All right, another thing that you guys might find interesting that I did was that there was a lady named by Betty Legan, and she had a military Chickasaw major, and her mother was a slave, and she sought to be enrolled for her family and descendants to obtain rights as a citizen by blood. Legal battles will be bringing hundreds of thousands, I mean, hundreds connection to Betty Legan, and the records case alone also led to a new genealogy avenue to follow. So basically, by her fighting, there's a new way that you could establish. So basically, when you're looking up these tribal roles outside of the muster roll, you can look at the DOS roll. There are many sources. There's the tribal roll, you got payment rolls, you got property claimants, you got census. There's thousands of DOS roll records from the descendants of the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the, the Seminole Creek. You can also find your ancestors. So you can find on Oklahoma is a website that you can find that will be very beneficial to you. That's free of charge. The National Archives, that's another place free of charge. You don't per se have to go online and find somebody to do it for you. You could do it yourself. You just got to put more of the work in. You know, I would say start doing yourself. When you hit a brick wall, a lot of times, and you went through ancestry.com, you did your DOS road, you did everything you could, and you're at that brick road, then that's when you bring in genealogists, because now you know the location of your people. You could variate, and you're still going to need to kind of double back if you don't, and get your great grandmother, your great grandfather's birth certificate, death certificate, or records of where they lived during that time period. If there's none of that, I'm going to say Ski Wado, thank you for your time and listening to me. I hope I brought some insight and some light to how you go through the process of looking for your ancestry. Now, I'm also going to mention that I'm going to make a part 3 or maybe 4. We're going to do this part 4. So part 3 and part 4 in the future. Also going to mention that throughout the South, so don't get wrapped up on just Oklahoma. There are many natives who stay down south because they felt more closer to the land. So from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, all of these native people stayed behind. And so they made a life for themselves. So it may be a little bit different, but a lot of people will be there. So then that makes it a little bit harder, because now if they're not connected to the native nation, then what? But I saw other people who didn't walk on the Trail of Tears and they were still able to locate their people, especially the Mississippi Choctaw, because actually a lot of them stayed behind. They did not leave Mississippi. All right. So if you guys want to get a hold of me, I have a new page called Black Bear Medicine Bag on Facebook, and I got a TikTok called Black Bear 6022. So you can also hit me up at YONA 317-602 at gmail.com. I give that out again. I got a new page called Black Bear Medicine Bag on Facebook. You can reach me also on TikTok at blackbear6022. And if you want to email me and just talk to me and tell me what you think, some suggestions, what would you like to see from Black Bear Medicine Bag? Next week we're going to be getting right back to the roots, but I had to take this out because when I see things, I have to say something, right? Because as far as a native person, it's not what you think. It's all about what you can do. It's not about me. It's always about you, us, them, right? All right. Until next time, Osta Asana'i. Until we meet again, good night.